A Cherokee took in a lost bride during the blizzard, and her husband returned with 300 warriors. The wind screamed through the pines like a living thing, a wild, furious voice that tore at the night while sheets of snow whipped across the mountainside so thick it erased the world beyond an arm's reach. And Tayani, broad-shouldered, calm-eyed, wrapped in a heavy wool coat with beads stitched by his grandmother's hands, paused mid-stride as his horse snorted hard against the cold. Something was wrong. Not wrong like a storm. Wrong like a presence. He dismounted, boots sinking into snow so deep it swallowed half his calves, and scanned the blizzard with narrowed eyes, listening past the shrieking wind for anything human. It came as a faint, broken sound, so small the storm nearly devoured it. A choked gasp carried on the gale. Tayani moved instantly, pushing through the whiteout with the sure-footed instinct of a man raised in these mountains, hand outstretched until it brushed against something soft and frozen stiff. A woman. Crumpled near a fallen pine, half buried in snow, her dress stiff with ice, her face burned raw by wind, lips cracked, eyes barely open beneath stuck-together lashes. A bride, gold ring on her finger, white fabric torn like she'd run through brambles, veil tangled around her wrist. She tried to lift her head, but it fell back against the snow, a fractured whisper escaping her. "Please, don't let him," before the storm swallowed the rest. Tayani knelt immediately, sliding an arm beneath her shoulders. The cold had sunk so deep into her body he could feel her bones trembling under her skin. "You hold on," he said, voice steady but low enough to thread beneath the wind. "You breathe for me." But her breaths were shallow, each one thinner than the last, her pulse fluttering weakly at her throat. She was minutes from freezing, maybe seconds. He gathered her into his arms, lifting her against his chest, her cheek pressing into the warm fabric of his coat. Even half-conscious, she clutched at him with whatever strength she had left, fingers curling into his collar like instinct, not trust, was choosing for her. The blizzard hit harder as he carried her, snow driving sideways so violently it stung his skin, but he kept moving, bowing his head over hers to shield her face. His cabin was still half a mile away, a long walk even in clear weather, but he didn't slow, didn't falter, because the sound she made when the wind touched her skin, a small, broken whimper, made something deep in his chest snap into place. Not pity, not duty, something older, something he didn't name. He pushed through the storm until the shape of his cabin appeared, a dark silhouette against the white fury of the blizzard, and as he reached the door and kicked it open with his boot, the warmth inside flooded the threshold. "You're safe," he murmured, stepping into the fire-lit glow. "Whoever you're running from won't touch you here." But even as he said it, she shook her head faintly against him. One terrified gesture, and the last thing she whispered before losing consciousness was a name he didn't recognize. A name that made dread settle in his gut. "He's coming." Tayani shut the cabin door with his boot, sealing out the blizzard's rage, but the woman in his arms didn't react to the sudden warmth. No flinch, no shift, no breath sharper than a fading whisper, just the faintest shiver that told him she was still straddling the thin line between life and the kind of cold that stole it quietly. He moved fast, not with panic, but with practiced precision, lowering her onto the buffalo hide near the hearth, brushing the snow and ice from her hair, her sleeves, her veil, watching her fingers twitch weakly each time his touch brushed over frozen skin. Her lips were nearly blue. Frost clung to her lashes like tiny crystals. He grabbed a blanket from the cedar chest, wrapped it around her shoulders, then crouched close to the fire to feed it more logs until the flames swelled high, throwing heat into the room. Stay with me, he murmured, as her eyes fluttered open, barely a sliver of color beneath heavy lids. She tried to speak, but her jaw trembled too hard, her breath a broken rattle. He lifted a warm cup of water to her lips, tilting it gently, and she swallowed only a thin slip of it before choking softly, panic flaring in her eyes until he steadied her head with one strong hand. Slow, he said. You're safe. No one can reach you in this storm. But at the word safe, something inside her seemed to recoil, a memory flickering through her expression like a shadow passing over the moon. She jerked weakly, fingers curling in the blanket as if she wanted to crawl backward, but her body wouldn't obey. That told him more than anything she could have spoken. Whoever she was running from wasn't a passing threat. He softened his voice even further, leaning just close enough for her to see him clearly, to read his face through fear-blurred vision. I am Tayani of the Blue Smoke Ridge. I will not harm you. Her gaze locked onto his for the first time, really locked, as if testing the truth in his words. Then she whispered, voice raw, Please, don't send me back. It was barely a breath, but it hit him like a blow. Back, meaning she belonged somewhere she'd fled with more terror than strength. He reached for her hand, slow, open, palm upward so she could choose, and after a long, trembling moment, she placed her frozen fingers in his. Small, ice-cold, desperate. You stay here tonight, he said, closing his hand gently around hers. You leave when you choose. Not when he chooses. A tear slid down her cheek, one that froze halfway before the heat of the fire thawed it, and she sagged forward, exhausted, trusting him only because the storm offered no other mercy. Outside, the blizzard roared, smothering the mountains in white. Inside, Tayani tucked another blanket around her trembling body, unaware that her whisper of warning, "He's coming," would mean more than he imagined. Because men like the one she feared didn't come alone. They came with armies, and she knew exactly what kind of army her husband commanded. The fire warmed the room fast, turning the shivering gusts outside into a muffled rage against the cabin walls. Yet the bride, fragile, soaked, veil half frozen to her hair, did not ease the tight, trembling tension in her limbs. Even as the heat touched her skin and color crept faintly back into her cheeks, she kept glancing toward the door as though the storm itself wasn't the thing she feared, but whatever stood behind it. Tayani saw the way her eyes followed the wood grain, tracking invisible footsteps in her memory, and he kept his movements slow, deliberate, never sudden, never reaching for her without letting her see his hands first. He hung her soaked cloak near the fire, then crouched beside her again, offering a warmed fur to replace it. When he draped it around her shoulders, she flinched, just barely, but caught herself. Fingers gripping the edge of the hide as if reminding herself she was indoors, alive, not on the snowbank where he'd found her fading into death. Rest, he said softly, his voice a deep rumble that steadied rather than startled. The storm will not let anyone reach this place. But she shook her head, a frantic, almost violent motion despite how weak she was, and whispered, He will. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't doubt, it was certainty. Tayani studied her in the flickering firelight, the pale skin bruised along her jaw, the faint rope mark hidden beneath her sleeve, the wedding ring that sat on her finger not like a promise, but like a shackle. Your husband, he said quietly. She swallowed hard, eyes closing as though even naming the man was dangerous. He doesn't stop. Tayani let silence settle. Not with pressure, but with understanding. He'd seen men like that. Men who believed a wife was possession, not partner. Men whose pride cracked like ice when challenged. Men who measured their strength in how tightly they held others down. But before he could speak, she pushed herself upright with a trembling burst of panic, reaching for the doorframe as if to bolt back into the blizzard. Her fear wasn't logical, it was instinct. Survival turned feral, and it broke something in him to see it. He was beside her instantly, not grabbing her, not blocking her, but placing himself at an angle where she could see him, and the path behind him clearly. "You step outside in this storm," he said gently, "and you'll die before he arrives." Her breath hitched, tears gathering unbidden. Better than him finding me alone. Tayani exhaled slowly, deep, controlled, before reaching for a woven blanket and wrapping it around her again, with the careful steadiness of someone handling the most fragile ember of a dying fire. "You are not alone," he murmured. "Not tonight. Not while you are under my roof." She sagged forward at those words, as if the simple promise of not alone cut through layers of terror, and her fingers curled into his sleeve for balance, not fear. Outside, the blizzard snarled. Inside, she trembled. Not because she didn't trust him, but because trusting anyone was something she had not been allowed to do in a very long time. Tayani guided her back toward the hearth, not touching her except where she clung to his sleeve, her fingers tightening each time the cabin creaked beneath the weight of the storm. She moved like someone expecting danger to leap from every shadow, her breaths short, uneven, shallow enough that he feared she might faint again. But when she sank onto the buffalo hide, she stayed upright only because her hand refused to release him. He knelt beside her, letting her keep that fragile hold, offering warmth without pressure, space without distance. The firelight revealed more than the storm had allowed him to see. Faint bruises along the inside of her wrist where fingers had gripped too hard. The strange stiffness in her posture that came less from cold and more from a lifetime of bracing. Her wedding ring glimmered weakly. A dull gold band that looked too heavy for her thin hand, and when she noticed him glance at it, she jerked her hand back as though ashamed to be wearing it. "I can cut it off," he said softly. "Only if you ask." She stared at him, startled, confused, something like disbelief widening her eyes, before slowly shaking her head. "No. If he sees it gone." Her throat closed around the rest of the sentence, terror slamming through her like a returning tide. Tayani leaned closer, calm as stone. "He will not get close enough to notice." But she didn't believe that yet. She couldn't. "He has men," she whispered. "He has power. People listen when he speaks." "Then speak your truth," Tayani said. Her breath locked in her chest. She shook her head again, faster this time, clutching the fur around her as if hiding inside it. "I can't. He says my voice is trouble." Tayani felt something sharp twist inside him, a familiar, bitter recognition of the kind of man who carved fear into women and called it loyalty. "Your voice is yours," he said firmly but gently. "You owe him nothing." She blinked, and 2 tears slipped free before she could stop them. She wiped them away quickly, as if crying was something she wasn't allowed to do. He let her take her time, letting the fire fill the silence, letting her heartbeat settle. When she finally whispered, "He'll come for me," Tayani answered without hesitation. "He will not find you." She stared at him like she wanted to believe it, but didn't know how. So he offered something safer. "Tell me your name," he said. "That alone is your choice, not his." She swallowed, eyes trembling, but no sound came. Her voice wasn't gone. It had been taken. She looked down at her hands, ring flashing in the firelight, and whispered so quietly he almost missed it. "I don't want to say anything that leads him here." Tayani's jaw tightened. This was fear carved deep. Too deep. Then don't speak his name, he murmured. Not now, not ever. You speak what you choose. She looked at him for a long, shaking moment, then lifted her hand again, curling her trembling fingers into his sleeve with a faint, desperate strength. She wasn't ready to speak her story, but she had made her first choice. And she chose him. The storm eased only enough for the wind to shift direction, but even that small change carried something sharp with it, an instinct that pulled Tayani to his feet before the bride could unfurl her grip from his sleeve. She watched him stand with wide, frightened eyes, her fingers frozen in place like they feared she'd vanish the moment he walked more than 2 steps away. I'm not leaving, he assured gently, and after a long, trembling hesitation, she released his sleeve, though her hand hovered in the air as if waiting to catch him again. Tayani stepped to the door, opened it just a crack, and the cold slapped his face instantly, raw, biting, laced with something far more dangerous than snow. Tracks, fresh ones. He saw them immediately, illuminated faintly by the dim morning gray filtering through the storm. Not the meandering prints of someone lost, not the dragging steps of a woman stumbling through a blizzard, but deep, deliberate boot marks cutting a hard line across the ridge above his cabin. Not one pair. 3. Moving with purpose, moving with direction, moving toward her. He tightened his grip on the edge of the door, the wind whipping snow into the cabin until he shut it again, slow and careful, not wanting the sound to frighten her more. When he turned, she was standing, barely, but standing, clutching the blanket around her like armor, her breath fast and shallow. She didn't ask if something was wrong. She just whispered, "They've found me." Tayani crossed to her in 3 quiet steps, steadying her arm where it shook. "Not yet," he said. "But they are searching." Her knees buckled with the weight of that truth, but he caught her before she fell, guiding her back toward the hearth. She sank onto the hide, clutching his forearm now, not merely for balance, but for survival, her nails digging in with a desperation that came from memory, not imagination. "He sends scouts first," she choked out, "then riders, then the warriors." Tayani inhaled, a slow, controlled breath that steadied the heat rising in his chest. "How many?" She shook her head weakly. "Hundreds. He commands, hundreds." Her voice cracked like something inside her broke open at the admission. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Not pushing, not restraining, simply grounding. "Did you do something he claims needs punishment?" She looked up, eyes shimmering with terror. "I left." Tayani's jaw clenched. Just left. Walked away from a man who saw her as possession, and for that, she was being hunted through a blizzard. "No one owns you," he said quietly. She flinched, not because of him, but because no one had ever said that to her. Her breath trembled as she leaned forward, whispering, "He'll burn the mountain down to find me." Tayani didn't argue, didn't doubt, didn't comfort with lies. Instead, he stood, strode to the window, and pushed aside the hide covering it just enough to see the ridge. The tracks were disappearing beneath fresh snowfall, but the threat was not. "Let him come," Tayani murmured, voice calm, cold, resolute. "This mountain stands with me." Behind him, she covered her mouth with one shaking hand. Not a sob, not fear, just the overwhelming realization that, for the first time in her life, someone was preparing to stand between her and a man who commanded an army. The storm thickened again, hurling sheets of white against the cabin walls like the mountain itself wanted to bury every sound, every scent, every trace that she even existed. But the bride's breathing had turned sharp, uneven, frantic in a way that told Tayani she wasn't seeing the cabin anymore. She was seeing someplace far worse. She pressed both hands to her temples, shaking her head as if trying to force memories back into whatever corner she'd locked them in, the fur-lined blanket slipping from her shoulders. Tayani knelt before her, not touching her, just placing himself in her line of sight until her gaze jerked toward him, wild and unmoored. "You are here," he murmured. "Not there. Here." Her throat bobbed in a painful swallow. "You don't understand," she whispered. "He doesn't let people leave. Not wives. Not servants. Not anyone." Her voice cracked on the last word, breaking into a sound too raw to be anything but truth. Tayani let the silence settle, steady and warm, offering her a place to put the words that had been caged inside her for far too long. She sucked in a shivering breath, closed her eyes, and whispered, "He married me for land." Tayani's jaw tightened, but he stayed calm, letting her speak before asking questions. "My father—" She paused, fingers curling into fists. "Sold me. Said it was better than starving." Her voice clipped, like she'd repeated that excuse so many times it had carved itself into her bones. "He promised my husband would be kind. He lied." She opened her eyes, staring at the fire like it was the only thing holding her together. "He used me as a trophy, a warning. A possession to show his warriors he controlled everything he touched. He said if I ever embarrassed him, if I ever disobeyed—" Her breath hitched violently. "He'd put me somewhere no one would find me again." Tayani felt something cold settle in his chest. Not shock, not anger, but the quiet certainty that he had seen this kind of man before. The kind who built power out of fear. The kind who called cruelty leadership. The kind who believed owning a woman meant owning her voice, her breath, her future. "So you ran," he said softly. She nodded, tears streaking down her cheeks unnoticed. "I waited for the first snow. I thought the blizzard would slow them, but—" Her hands shook violently. "He doesn't stop. He'll bring all 300. He'll surround these mountains until he takes back what he thinks is his." Tayani leaned forward, his voice dropping into a calm, unyielding rumble. "You are not his." She flinched like the words hurt, because they didn't match the world she'd lived in. He reached out with one steady hand and let it hover near hers without touching. "Say it," he whispered. "You are not his." Her lips parted, the truth trembling in her throat like it was trying to break free of chains. But before she could speak, a distant sound cut through the storm, low, rhythmic, unmistakable. Drumbeats. One, then another, then dozens layered beneath the blizzard's howl. She froze, terror turning her blood to ice. "They've found him," she whispered. "His scouts, his riders." Tayani rose to his full height, shoulders squaring as he stepped toward the door. "No," he said, voice like stone cracking. "They've found me." The drumbeats rolled through the blizzard like a second storm. Slow, rhythmic, spaced with the precision of riders who didn't need to see their path to know exactly where they were going. And Tayani stood at the door, long enough to feel the vibrations settle into the earth beneath his boots, the kind of movement that meant disciplined men were approaching, not scattered searchers. Behind him, the bride pressed her hands to her mouth to muffle a broken gasp, her eyes locked on his back like he was the single barrier between her and a fate she had already lived once and would rather die than return to. Tayani lifted one hand and motioned for her to stay behind him, then unbarred the door with quiet resolve, just as a shadow loomed through the white haze. One rider, dismounting with a fluid ease, snow whipping around his figure until the wind parted enough for his features to appear beneath the hood of a heavy fur-lined cloak. Not her husband. Not yet. A forward scout. a warrior with paint along his jawline and a cold, assessing stare that locked onto Tayani the moment he stepped into view. "You shelter someone who does not belong to you," the warrior said, his voice steady despite the storm clawing at his coat. Tayani didn't blink. "I shelter a woman who would have died in the snow." The warrior's gaze narrowed faintly. Respect, not approval. "Her husband seeks her." Tayani stepped off the porch, boots sinking deeply into the snow. "Her husband hunts her," he corrected. The warrior tilted his head slightly, as if weighing Tayani's choice of words. "He commands 300, the man said, "and they are near." Behind Tayani, inside the cabin, the bride's breath caught, a small, strangled sound quickly swallowed by fear. The warrior's eyes flicked toward the movement inside, and Tayani's body shifted instinctively, blocking the view with his frame. "You will not look upon her," he said, the quiet rumble of his voice carrying more warning than volume. For the first time, the warrior's expression cracked, not with anger, but curiosity. "You defend her." "I stand between cruelty and its target," Tayani answered. A slow exhale left the warrior's lungs, vapor mixing with the snow. "He says she is his wife, his property." Tayani's jaw tightened. "A wife is not property." The warrior studied him, long, deep, measuring the spirit of the man before him. Then he spoke more softly. "He will come, with many. He will demand." "He can demand to the wind," Tayani said. "It will answer him better than I will." A faint shift passed across the warrior's face. Something like respect, something like warning, something like the first shift in a fracture. 300 riders, the warrior repeated, as though reminding both of them of the impossibility of what stood ahead. "One man cannot stand against that." "No," Tayani agreed. "But one truth can." The warrior's eyes sharpened. "What truth?" Tayani turned slightly, just enough to let the firelight inside the cabin catch the edge of the bride's form, still trembling, still clutching the blanket, still watching him with a fragile trust she'd never been allowed to offer anyone. "That she is not his to take," Tayani said quietly. The warrior didn't answer. Instead, he pulled his hood lower, stepped back into the blizzard, and said only one thing as the snow swallowed him whole. "Then prepare, the others are close." And with that, the first scout vanished into white, leaving behind a silence heavy enough to make the walls shake, not from the storm, but from the weight of 300 riders closing in. The drumbeats multiplied before the blizzard even thinned, turning the ground beneath the cabin into a slow, rolling thunder that vibrated through the floorboards, up the walls, into the bride's bones, as she curled against the hearth with both hands pressed over her mouth to hold back the terrified sob rising in her throat. Tayani stood motionless at the door, eyes fixed on the snow-blurred ridgeline where shapes began to emerge one by one, dark silhouettes on horseback, riding in formation so tight even the storm parted around them. First 10, then 30, then 100, then more, until the valley below his cabin looked like a river of warriors, the red and black war markings on their shields flashing between gusts of wind like sparks in a white inferno. 300. Just as she had said. They lined the tree line with quiet discipline, no shouting, no threats, just the heavy presence of men following a husband who believed the world belonged to him. And then he appeared, a tall figure on a pale horse, riding to the front of the formation with a confidence carved from arrogance, not honor. His coat was trimmed in silver, his braid was wrapped in bone. And the moment the bride saw him through the window's frost-glazed glass, her body folded like she'd been struck, with no sound, just a silent collapse of breath and hope. Tayani crossed the room instantly, kneeling beside her as she shook violently, hands clawing at the blanket like she was trying to disappear into the floor. "Look at me," he murmured, anchoring his voice low and calm, while his own pulse hammered in his throat. When she finally lifted her eyes, he said, "You are not his." A sob ripped free, raw and small, but she nodded, just once, because she needed to believe it for even a single heartbeat. Outside, the husband raised a hand, and a horn sounded, deep and long, echoing through the canyon like a challenge carved into the storm. "Bring her out," he shouted, voice booming with a power fed by numbers, not righteousness. Tayani stood, stepped to the door, and pushed it open just enough for his voice to carry. "She is not leaving this cabin." Laughter rolled across the warriors, a low, disbelieving wave. The husband leaned forward in his saddle. "You stand alone, Cherokee." Snow whipped between them like shattered glass, but Tayani's voice cut through it. "I stand with truth." The husband's eyes narrowed, lips curling. "Truth is what I decide. Not today." The valley went silent. The wind paused. Even the horses seemed to sense the shift. And then, slowly, deliberately, Tayani stepped fully onto the porch, the storm swirling around his shoulders as he lifted his chin. "If you want her," he said, "you come through me." A murmur rippled through the 300 like sparks jumping between dry branches. Not fear. Not yet. But surprise. Because they had expected a runaway bride, a terrified woman, a quiet surrender. Not a Cherokee warrior who faced down an army with nothing but conviction in his stance, and a woman's truth at his back. In the cabin doorway behind him, the bride clutched the frame, trembling. Not because she doubted him, but because for the first time in her life, someone was standing in front of her instead of behind the man who owned her. And outside, 300 warriors shifted in their saddles, not readying to charge, but waiting for the husband's command. A command he gave with a single, furious word: "Take her." And the valley erupted. The valley roared to life as 300 warriors surged forward, hooves pounding like a second heartbeat beneath the storm. But they did not charge the cabin. They formed a tightening circle around it, moving with the controlled precision of men used to overwhelming their enemies with presence alone. From inside the doorway, the bride let out a strangled cry, her fingers digging into the wooden frame until her knuckles blanched white, and Tayani lifted one hand behind him, not touching her, but steadying her with the certainty of a man who would not let the world swallow her again. The husband rode through the ranks, parting the formation like a blade slicing water, his pale horse snorting clouds of steam as he stopped 10 paces from the porch. The snow eased just enough for Tayani to see the cold triumph in the man's eyes. The confidence of someone who believed numbers were the same as truth. "Bring her," the husband ordered, gesturing sharply. 2 riders dismounted, stepping forward. Tayani didn't move. "She is not going anywhere she does not choose," he said, voice steady as the mountains rising behind him. The husband's lip curled. "She has no choices. She is mine." Behind Tayani, the bride flinched so violently she nearly collapsed, a small whimper breaking in her throat like a snapped twig. That was the sound that made Tayani's blood turn to stone. He stepped down from the porch, meeting the husband in the open snow. "If she is yours," he said quietly, "why does she fear you more than death?" A ripple went through the warriors, soft, uncertain, like the first crack in ice. The husband barked a laugh. "Fear is obedience." Tayani's expression didn't shift, but something in his posture did. Something the warriors noticed, something the storm seemed to notice. Fear, Tayani said, taking one more step forward, is what men use when they have nothing else. The husband leaned in his saddle. And what do you use? Honor. Truth, Tayani answered, and your men deserve to hear it. The husband's eyes darkened. Enough. But the damage was done. Several warriors leaned forward in their saddles, studying Tayani with sharp, measuring eyes, not hostile but listening. And Tayani spoke again. Not loud, not dramatic, just plain and cutting. I found her half dead in the snow. No escort, no cloak, no riders searching, no concern from the man who claims she is his life. Murmurs rose, small at first, then louder, like wind finding its way through a canyon. The husband's jaw tightened. She ran. She fled, Tayani corrected. From what? He turned, looking not at the husband, but at the bride, who clung to the doorframe as though the question itself might shatter her. From what did you run? She shook her head, trembling, breath catching in shallow bursts. Speak, the husband snapped, or I'll— You'll do nothing, Tayani said, stepping between them completely. He extended his hand toward her, open, palm upward, inviting but not pulling. You choose, you speak, or you stay silent, but he commands nothing here. Something in her broke, not in fear, but in confinement. She took one shaking step forward, then another, and with her voice scraping out of a throat bruised by years of being silenced, she whispered, I ran because he hurt me. The valley stilled. 300 warriors froze for the first time since they arrived, not because she spoke loudly, but because she spoke at all. Her voice trembled. I ran because he said if I ever disobeyed, he would kill me. A long breath moved through the warriors like a wind shift. The husband snarled, Lies! Look at her! Tayani cut in, voice like flint striking steel. Look! The warriors did. And the truth, her bruises, her shaking, her terror, spoke louder than any army. That was the moment the husband's power cracked, not from force, from truth finally spoken into the cold morning air. The moment that turned the valley from his weapon into his witness. For a long, suspended moment, the valley held its breath. 300 warriors staring at a woman whose voice had never been meant to carry beyond the walls of the man who claimed her. She stood trembling in the doorway, snow melting in her hair, fear tightening every muscle in her body, and yet the truth, her truth, hung in the cold air like a spark searching for dry tinder. It found it. One warrior shifted in his saddle, then another, then a third. Not aggressively, not with hands drifting toward weapons, but with slow, deliberate movements that signaled something far more dangerous to a tyrant than battle. Doubt. The husband's face tightened, fury cracking through his mask of confidence. You dare believe her? He snapped at his men, but there was a tremor in his voice now, a quiver only a man losing grip on power could produce. She is frightened, delusional, ungrateful. The bride flinched, instinctively stepping back, but Tayani moved with her. One step, no touch, just his presence between her and the man she had run from. You call her delusional, Tayani said, voice steady and low. Yet she ran into a storm that kills men twice her strength. What did she fear so deeply she chose death over returning to you? Silence rippled through the warriors like a cold wind sweeping off a frozen lake. The husband opened his mouth, but nothing came. No explanation, no justification, nothing but the sharp realization that numbers alone could not crush truth once it had taken shape. Bring her, he barked finally, desperation edging his words. She is mine by vow. A vow made under fear, Tayani replied, taking another slow step forward. A vow you enforced with fists and threats is not a vow, it is bondage. The husband snarled. You think you can save her? You think any of these men will protect a woman who ran from her duty? But even before he finished speaking, one of the riders dismounted, an older warrior with gray streaking his braid and wisdom lining the corners of his eyes. He walked through the snow and stood beside Tayani, silent but firm, facing his own leader with a calm that cut sharper than any blade. A husband who breaks a woman's spirit breaks his own honor, the elder warrior said. We do not fight for a man without honor. The husband's face drained of color. Then 2 more warriors dismounted. Then 5. Then 10. Until nearly a third of the formation stood on the ground, not charging, not threatening, simply refusing to take his side. The husband's horse stamped nervously, sensing the shift he refused to admit. You are making a mistake, he spat at them. She belongs to herself, Tayani said, turning towards the bride and extending his hand. Not demanding, not pulling, just offering. Her breath trembled, her eyes flooding with disbelief and fragile hope, but she stepped forward anyway. Slowly, one foot sinking into the snow, then the next, until her shaking hand slid into Tayani's. Gasps rippled through the valley as the husband's last grip on power shattered like brittle ice beneath spring thaw. You choose, Tayani said gently, loud enough for every warrior to hear. Where do you stand? Her voice broke, but it broke free. Not with him. The husband lunged, fury exploding, but before he could reach her, 3 warriors seized his arms, pulling him from his saddle and dragging him backward as he screamed into the snow, his power dissolving under the weight of 300 silent, watching witnesses. No one looked at him. They looked at her, at the woman who had spoken, at the warrior who had listened, at the truth that had toppled a man who believed himself untouchable. And when Tayani guided her back towards the cabin, her fingers tightening around his with something that felt like the first breath of freedom, the storm finally began to ease, its rage softening into pale morning light, as if the mountain itself recognized that she was no longer running. She was walking. Free. If this tale touched you, even for a heartbeat, ride with us again. Subscribe to Crimson West for more true-hearted frontier stories of courage, mercy, and the kind of quiet justice the world often forgets.